Hello everyone, I'm Spencer with Headwaters Science Institute, and welcome back to our Monday Science Lessons. If today's your first time joining us, I'd recommend that you go back and watch last week's lesson because we build on some of the things that we did last week here today. The materials you're going to need for today's lesson are pretty simple. You're going to need a pencil, some paper, something to write with, and then a couple special things. There's a worksheet in the description of this video below that you'll need to print off or use on a tablet or computer. You also need to have the list of questions that you came up with last week about phenology. Take a moment, make sure you have all of these materials, and pause the video if you need more time to get everything together. So let's start things off a little bit by thinking about what we learned last week about phenology. What I'd like you to do is take your pen and a paper and just write down a few notes about what you remember about phenology from last week. I'll do the same and we can compare what we come up with. So, if we remember back to last week, phenology is the study of the timing of plant and animal development. For example, what month of year do flowers bloom? Or when do insects hatch and pollinate flowers? Or what time of year does pollen start coming in the air and giving us allergies? All of these things are part of the study of phenology, which has actually been going on for thousands of years. People have been recording what time different plants and animals grow and develop or have young and reproduce, because it's been a really important part of how people interact with nature around them. So now that we've reminded ourselves what phenology is all about, let's take a closer look at how scientists actually study phenology. To kick things off, I'd like you to take a guess. So your next job is to, on your piece of paper, write down what types of things do you think affect the timing of when plants or animals develop during the spring, summer, or fall. So here's the list of things that I came up with right here. The first thing on my list of what might affect the timing of when plants or animals develop is temperature. As spring comes and the temperatures get warmer, that might affect how plants and animals respond to their environment. Another thing I was thinking about was rain. So let's say we're in a desert and there's not a lot of moisture. If it rains, plants might use that water in the soil to bloom flowers. Another thing that came across my mind was sunlight. Because we live in the northern part of the Earth, the northern hemisphere, our days are shorter in the winter and longer in the summer. Now that we're transitioning from winter into spring, our days are getting longer and longer, and there might be more sunlight during the days for plants and animals to soak up. The last thing I was thinking about was frozen ground. You might not have frozen ground where you are, but where I am, there's about 2 feet of snow on the ground, and some of the ground itself is pretty hard. That would probably be hard for a plant to grow or start a seed in, so my guess is they might wait for the ground to thaw before doing anything. Let's take a moment and think a little bit more about temperature. It's kind of one of the key things about phenology, and I'd like you to dive into that a little bit more. So, on your piece of paper that you just brainstormed on, I'd like you to write down the types of things that you think might affect temperature in the area that you're studying, whether it's outside your house or in a park nearby where you live. Nice job! So I'll share some of the things that I came up with what might affect temperature around my house. So the first thing I thought of was whether something was in the sun or the shade. Because the sun can be really bright and cause a lot of heat, I was thinking that that might make a difference. The other thing I was thinking about was surface type. I don't know if you've ever walked on asphalt on a hot day in bare feet and felt how hot it was on your toes. Conversely, on the same day you could walk on a patch of grass and it wouldn't burn your feet. It would feel a lot cooler. That's because dark surfaces tend to absorb heat from the sun a lot more than lighter colored surfaces. So maybe if there's something black in your backyard, the area around that might be a little bit warmer than if there was something light colored. All of these things that we just talked about may seem kind of simple, but that's exactly how scientists study phenology right now. One of the really interesting phenology projects that I got to be a part of was one time I went out and caught butterflies using this net here, and then I compared them to the number of flowers that were flowering at the same time using a field guide like this. The goal of this experiment was to figure out if climate change was affecting the timing of when plants flower and when butterflies migrate, causing them to not happen at the same time. Because butterflies need nectar from flowers and plants need butterflies to pollinate them, it's important that these two things stay in sync. It was also really fun because I got to go out and count all sorts of really neat butterflies and flowers. By measuring things like temperature, rain, sun, the number of organisms that we might find in a place, or their phase of development, like whether something has grown leaves, is still growing leaves, or has already made flowers and seeds, scientists are able to track phenology over time and see if things are changing long term and how that might be. So now that we know a little bit about phenology, we're going to get to the fun part. I'm going to help you figure out how to create a research project out of one of the questions that you came up with last week. The cool thing about this is this research project is all your own. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just going to help you figure out how to come up with the best research project that you can. This can be a little bit of a hard process, but we've got 3 great steps for helping you choose a great research question. So let's pull out our list of questions that we came up with last week and figure out how we can come up with a great research question. The 3 tips that I have for you today are, number 1, study something that you have access to now. For example, I might be really interested in plants that live in the jungle, but I don't live in a jungle, so it might be hard to study those types of plants. The same thing goes for the time of year. Leaves that turn color in the fall are a really cool part of phenology, but right now it's spring, so we have to focus on what is happening around us right now. The second thing to keep in mind as you're coming up with a great research question is you want to try to make your research question specific to something that you could measure. For example, some of the trees around my house have pine cones in them at the very top of the tree, but I don't have a ladder tall enough to do that, or someone to help me do that safely. So I might study things that I might be able to find in my backyard at around eye level. The third thing to keep in mind when you're coming up with a great research question is you want to make sure that you can measure a lot of the things you're studying. For example, all the pine trees in my backyard could be a great project, but I also have 1 or 2 shrubs. I probably couldn't do a project around those shrubs, but each one of those shrubs has many branches and there are many buds that are starting to grow on those branches. A research project I could do around those shrubs is count the buds on different sides of the shrub to figure out if the buds on the north side are developing faster than the buds on the south side. Now, your job is to be a scientist and to go through the list of questions that you came up with, and I want you to choose the one that you are the most excited about that also fits these 3 tips. You can always change or reword a question that you are excited about to better fit these 3 suggestions. So, take a few minutes. You can pause this video while you work to choose the very best research question that you can. Nice work! Now that you have your own research question, we're going to start working on the worksheet that you printed out for today. If you see right here, at the top there's a space for your name, and the first thing below your name is a place to write your research question. Take a moment and write your research question on the top line here before we go much further. Now that we have our research question written down, our next step is to make a hypothesis or prediction of what we think the answer to our question is going to be. Remember, a hypothesis always includes a reason why you made the prediction you did. So if I said there will be more pine cones in taller trees than smaller trees for my hypothesis, I could include the reason I think this because the taller trees might get more sunlight. Take a moment and write out your hypothesis here before we move on to the next section. Now that we've made a hypothesis, our next step is to try and figure out how we're actually going to do our experiment. We can do this on the section at the very bottom that's numbered 1 through 7. We're going to think of this a little bit like a recipe. Scientists often call this section their methods because it tells them how they're going to do their experiment. What I want you to think about is what types of measurements are you going to take? How exactly are you going to take those measurements? How many times are you going to take each measurement? And what types of places are you going to take those measurements in? All of these things can be written out step by step like a recipe in your methods section. So let's take a moment and pause this video while we work through our methods section to figure out how we're actually going to do our experiment. It's really important when we're coming up with our methods section to make sure that we're designing an experiment that we can actually do. We want to make sure that all the things in our experiment are something that we have the time, the equipment, and the space to be able to do. If you aren't sure about what might be feasible, you can always ask an adult or email me, Spencer at headwaterscienceinstitute.org, for some suggestions on how to make this work. The last task I have for you for our worksheet for today is to plan out how many times are we going to repeat our experiment or repeat our methods. Because there are many things outside that might affect when a plant flowers or the time of year that an insect might hatch, we want to do our experiment multiple times, because what if we only measured one flower and maybe this flower had too much food or too little food and might be different from some other flowers nearby? Many scientists repeat their experiment 5, 10, or even more times. But it's important for you as the person in charge of your experiment to decide how many repeats of your methods make the most sense. Scientists often call these repeats replicates. If you see right here on your worksheet, it asks you how many replicates will you make. Take a moment and think about the answer before you write it down. Once you've written down your answer to the replicates, we can move on to the next section. Alright everyone, that's pretty much everything we have for today's lesson. Nice job! You've come up with a really cool science experiment, and we can't wait to see what this turns into. So for your homework for this coming week, there are 2 parts. The first part is really fun. What I want you to do is to go outside and try out the experiment you just came up with. Sometimes things will work really smoothly the first time. Other times you might need to revise things or come up with a slightly different way to do your methods. This is all part of science, and for your homework, once you try things out, you can make adjustments to your methods to make sure that your experiment really tests the question that you came up with from the outset. The second part of your homework is, when you're outside doing your experiment, I want you to write down some of the data that you've collected. We've included a data table in today's materials for you to use to write down what you collect. But it's really important with phenology data that you record the date that you made those measurements. You can always look up the temperature, if you don't have a thermometer, from a weather station near where you live. We have a Google Meet where you can log on and ask me or another one of our Headwaters instructors any questions about your science project, like what type of plant is this in my backyard, or how do I take this type of measurement? Anything related to your project, you can log on between 11 and 12 Pacific time and ask us those questions so you can create an even better science experiment. That's all we have for today, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and I can't wait to see you more this week.